Bonjour, agus Gia Dív. Welcome to The Irish in Canada, the podcast exploring the histories and legacies of Irish immigrants and their Canadian descendants. I'm your host, Jane McGaughey. This is episode number 1, Introductions. So who am I, and what is this podcast? I'm the Johnson Chair of Quebec and Canadian Irish Studies and an associate professor at Concordia University's School of Irish Studies in Montreal. I teach courses on the Irish in Canada, the Irish in Montreal, Irish and Canadian rebellions in the 19th century, and sexualities in the Irish diaspora, among others. As well as being an Irish Canadian, the first Irish branch of my family arrived here in the 1780s, I have been learning, researching, and eventually teaching about the Irish in Canada for over 20 years, first as an undergraduate and graduate student at the University of Toronto, and then later as a history professor. My PhD at Birkbeck College, University of London, looked at representations of unionist masculinities in the north of Ireland between 1912 and 1923, which then became the premise for my first book, Ulster's Men. In 2020, I published Violent Loyalties, Manliness, Migration, and the Irish in the Canadas, where I looked at how Irish male migrants were either accepted or rejected by Canadian colonial society in the years before the Great Irish Famine. Along with my colleagues at the School of Irish Studies, I focus on Ireland's rich history and culture, and the experiences of the Irish abroad from an interdisciplinary perspective. That means I'm trained as a social and cultural historian, but I also use things like literature, music, politics, war studies, gender, and contemporary pop culture to understand what it meant and means to be of Irish descent in modern Canada. But this podcast isn't meant to be just for academics or university students. I want to tell stories about the Irish in Canada with a very broad definition of what that can mean. Some of these narratives might be familiar to you. Others you might never have heard before. Despite a bit of a bland reputation at times, Canadian history is actually a very exciting and controversial subject. I use stories about the Irish at different times in Canada's history to highlight a side of the country's past that doesn't always make it into a history textbook. Canadian history can also be very regionally based. Looking at Irish experiences is one way to break free of provincial boundaries in order to see things from a different point of view. Over this first season of the podcast, there will be a particular focus on the Irish men, women, and children who arrived in what is now Canada in the first half of the 19th century. The very first Irishmen arrived on the shores of the Avalon Peninsula in Newfoundland as seasonal fishermen, perhaps as early as the 1530s, at the same time as the Protestant Reformation in Europe, Suleiman the Magnificent rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem, massive droughts and famines affecting Ming Dynasty China, and when Henry VIII was about to behead Anne Boleyn. Small groups of Irish families followed in the 17th and 18th centuries, both before and after the fall of New France, and then the great waves of Irish immigration began in the early 1800s to Lower and Upper Canada, today's Quebec and Ontario. By the time of Canadian Confederation in 1867, Quebec had a higher proportion of Irish-born residents than any other part of North America. March 2022 marked the first official Irish Heritage Month in Canada, thanks to the efforts of James Maloney, MP for Etobicoke Lakeshore in Ontario. The statement from the Government of Canada on March 1st noted that, quote, Irish Canadians have greatly contributed to the story of our country, and this month is an opportunity to learn more about their history and positive impact, end quote. The Irish have had many notable influences on this country at national, provincial, and local levels in times of both tragedy and triumph. Recognizing the legacies of the Irish in Canada is important, but it's also important to note that these same legacies and events can be complicated, to say the least. Not everything has a positive impact. History should never be a rote repetition of names and dates that bore people, and that's certainly not what I want to do with this podcast. At its best, history should make us feel a full spectrum of emotions: happiness, rage, disgust, fear, panic, joy. Never was a simple or single template that every immigrant from Ireland followed when they arrived here. And what happened to these people, and what they sometimes did to others, are events loaded with emotion. The Irish in Canada were both colonized and colonizers. They were desperate refugees and part of the colonial establishment. They were poor and rich, male and female, rural and urban, desired, disposable, and at times despised. They were human, and finding out more about what happened to them in a variety of narratives can be quite illuminating about our own humanity. In March of 1991, Canadian television began to run a series of 60-second short films highlighting different episodes in Canadian history, the Heritage Minutes. 50 of these were eventually produced between 1991 and 1995. For those of us who grew up in the 1990s, Heritage Minutes were rather inescapable, whether you were watching the CBC or CTV, or waiting in the theater for a movie to start. Burnt Toast, the Halifax Explosion, the Underground Railroad, and Peach Basket basketball became an inextricable part of Canadian culture for a new generation. Only one of these Heritage Minutes dealt directly with Irish Canadian history, the adoption of Molly Johnson and other Irish famine orphans by Quebecois families in 1847. My aim in this first season is to spend about 15 minutes for each podcast highlighting other figures and events from Irish Canadian history that I think should be better known than they currently are. My own take on Heritage Minutes, if you will. In future episodes, we will be looking at murder, disease, public riots, love affairs, lunatic asylums, rebellions, ghost stories, and some very violent lumberjacks. I'm really not kidding about that last one. My hope is that the Irish in Canada will be about both positives and negatives in our national story, tales of hardship, violence, and pain, as well as those of triumph, goodwill, and strength. History shouldn't be easy. Learning more about Irish experiences in Canada and the legacies they created, good, bad, and complicated, is an important part of understanding not only our past, but also our future. Next week, we'll begin by looking at perhaps the most famous Irish-Canadian woman of the 19th century, and the murders that have made her a global sensation for nearly 200 years. Thanks for listening to The Irish in Canada. The show was researched, written, and narrated by me, Jane McGaughey. This season was edited and mixed by Patrick McMaster and produced by Marian Mulvena. Our theme music was composed and performed by Kate Bevan Baker, and our logo was designed by Claire Macaulay. Many thanks to the School of Irish Studies at Concordia University in Montreal, the Canadian Irish Studies Foundation, Le Gouvernement de Québec, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for their support. If you like the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. You can spread the word about the Irish in Canada by following us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at Irish Canada Pod. Our website is the irishincanadapodcast.ca. That's where you can find show notes for our episodes, including lists of sources and recommendations for further reading. Until next time, go raibh maith agaibh.